welcome back to another episode of the DD Geopolitics podcast. I am Sarah and I'm joined by my co-host JM. And today, finally having Nina Byzantina on, an independent analyst with a PhD in history and a focus on modern and contemporary Russian culture and also U.S. foreign policy. Welcome, Nina. How are you today?
Thank you for having me. I think I'm sufficiently caffeinated for pursuing the subjects that we have planned for today. So thank you.
I don't think that I am sufficiently. JM, hi, how are you?
Oh, I'm kind of running on adrenaline, but hey, I'm
natural caffeination. Yeah.
So today we're going to be talking about some stuff that JM has wanted to talk about for a while. So I'm going to pass it off to him to take the lead, and I will be here to ask the stupid questions.
Stupid questions. As teachers say, they're never stupid questions.
But they're always the best questions.
Exactly.
Always the most thought-provoking, and you're like, I didn't think of it that way.
Yes, and then we say, let's unpack this, and then we... Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And one should always be aware that when Sarah says, I'm about to ask a stupid question, that she means it's going to be very deeply insightful and you're going to be caught off guard and like, I don't
Stupid question
isn't
to make you look stupid. Yes, that's the that's the trick behind the stupid question. Just kidding.
Exactly. But what I wanted to start off with is that we've got a few things to cover because there's a lot to discuss, but I think it would be something more of the Banderite deep state, I guess you could call it, the deep movement, the deep conspiracy, like something out of a cheesy 70s or 80s movie about all the Nazis got in one place and took over the government, and you're like, nah, but then Chrystia Freeland does exist. And then we also want to talk about a different Ukraine as represented by a Ukrainian journalist, public intellectual, Oles Buzina, because you have done work in republishing translations of a number of his articles where he is attacking the official Banderite super Ukrainian patriotism, and he is actually discussing how this isn't patriotic at all, and these people don't love Ukraine as it is. They hate Ukraine as it is, and they want to destroy Ukraine as it is and recreate a Ukraine in their image that is the perfect Ukraine, but that's a Ukraine that never was, which means they hate Ukraine. So, and
which means chopping off anything that actually made the previous Ukrainian periods Ukraine, right? So it's the ethno-nationalism on steroids that doesn't really exist, I would say, in most places, perhaps in the Baltics. But generally, yeah, it doesn't really exist. So where would you like to start? I don't think it's a conspiracy, by the way, the Banderite underground, because obviously there is a lot of information. You know, the Soviet Union cannot ever be accused of handling things with soft gloves. It was pretty hardcore in terms of going after its enemies. And, you know, we can go back and think of how long it took the Soviet Union to even manage the Banderite underground. And it was a decade, right? So that was under Stalin. And obviously he passed away in 1953. But, you know, Stalin was a ruthless leader. And even he had trouble handling that underground in what today is Western Ukraine. So it's definitely not a conspiracy. I know you're being facetious, but yeah. So...
Yeah, I am being facetious, but I would actually like to start with Buzina because particularly on this channel and watching the war, one might get the sense that it was always locked in this way, that it was these two antagonistic peoples at it. But actually I want to go into the idea that in living memory, it was very, very different, and that for a lot of people, this came out suddenly out of left field, and that none of this was inevitable, that there were very strong Ukrainian alternatives of which Buzina was one of the most articulate. And so I wanted to first ask, when did you first hear about Oles Buzina?
I heard of him before the Maidan because I like to sort of keep in touch with international politics, and he was very well published in multiple Russian and Ukrainian language publications. And obviously my interest in history is shared in that regard. And so if you go online even today, you can find archives in various publications of his work going back to, let's say, after the Orange Revolution of 2004. where he was critical of the same things that he was critical heading towards the Maidan of 2013, 2014. And of course, as we know, he was assassinated in spring of 2015. This was one of the first major assassinations in Kiev. There were a couple of others. There was a politician whose last name was, I believe, Kalashnikov, who was also assassinated. So that sort of set the tone for the new post regime change Ukraine, or as I would say the official narrative goes, as the new free Ukraine heading on a European path, his assassination. So he was sort of this very interesting personification of someone who was definitely a patriot and who knew the history and the literature of his region very well. But at the same time, he considered Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, sort of the East Slavic people, as a triune people who could communicate with each other, who can have friendly relations, and who had a shared past, which today is certainly being denied with alternative histories about ancient Rus or Kievan Rus, however you'd like to call it. So I certainly saw his work prior to the Maidan, and then he really became prominent in terms of appearing on multiple Russian talk shows where he debated many Russian commentators. In some cases, I disagreed with his perspective, but I respected how well he could argue because he had this factual historical background, and he could sort of pull all these literary sources, all this historical information, sometimes really specific regional historic information to make his point. And of course, when you're watching someone and you really enjoy how they present themselves and what they're presenting, sometimes disagreeing but respecting their opinions, and all of a sudden you realize that they were gunned down in daylight, right? In 2015, it's really shocking. I still consider it shocking. So, historic information to make his point. And of course, when you're watching someone and you really...
I think one of the things to first emphasize about what was shocking about that is that, if I may read here a bit before I ask you the second question, from ABC, so the Australian state news broadcaster, which goes exactly to what you said, which is that when we meet our friend here, Anton Goroshchenko, anybody who follows this war on social media will know who I mean, that this was the day after Oleg Kalashnikov was killed in a similar attack as he was walking in. And what did Goroshchenko says? It seems the shooting of witnesses of the anti-Maidan affair continues. And that's all that he said. And he was one of the most senior members of the Interior Ministry. So this was a politically motivated assassination. But as you said, Oles Buzina was a patriot. So before we get into let's first get into that. What was it about his Ukrainian patriotism that could have made him a target for self-described Ukrainian patriots?
Well, he was very much anti-Banderite, so he completely rejected some of the political entities and military formations that are being exalted today. So SS Galicia, right, the Waffen SS division, the Ukrainian division within the German military during World War II, certainly rejected the Ukrainian, the UPA and the OUN, right, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, as being brutally violent towards not just other ethnicities, but Ukrainians who disagreed with their tactics. So they're sort of also targeting their own, not just, let's say, Poles, for instance. He saw the way that revisionism was really seeping into modern Ukrainian politics, and he openly talked about that. Why are we having burials for, or why are we exalting the former members of this Nazi German aligned division, right? So he definitely rejected all of this stuff that's now being whitewashed, and as part of historic revisionism, as we saw in Canada very recently, sort of the most recent example. He also was not anti-Soviet in the way that modern post-Maidan Ukraine is anti-Soviet, where they're rejecting absolutely anything good that came from the Soviet Union. Obviously, it's possible to criticize the Soviet Union in certain factual ways, and he would do so, but at the same time, he would acknowledge some of the benefits that the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic received from the Soviet Union, much like the Russian Empire. So his view was very objective. There was no completely chopping off or completely removing certain parts of history to try to mold it into something that seems to fit the current political agenda, the current political ideology, which then is so extreme that it becomes counterfactual and anti-historic or ahistoric. So this was definitely, and because he was so knowledgeable in history and he could quote sources in Ukrainian and in Russian, and you could read his articles today and you'll see it today, he was really a problem for those who wanted to pursue the Maidan course.
So before we get just to drill a bit down more into his Ukrainian patriotism and his vision of Ukraine, although you've spelled it out a bit more, I wanted to turn to a wonderful translation that you did of his 2009 article, SS Galicia Division Against Ukraine. And I wonder if you could discuss a bit his ideas about why the SS Galicia Division, rather than being an expression of Ukrainian independence and an assertion of Ukrainian identity and enabling Ukraine to emerge, was in fact very, very strongly anti-Ukraine, especially given what we saw in the Canadian Parliament.
Right. Well, I think that was kind of the first interesting thing is that this is from 2009. So that shows you that this is 5 years prior to the Maidan being a successful regime change. So he had that very consistent ideological trajectory of criticizing those undercurrents in Ukrainian politics, in Ukrainian history. And he's had multiple other articles where he talks about the same thing. The one I translated recently was, what would have happened if Nazi Germany had triumphed in Ukraine. So he basically, he lifts things coming from Hitler's own mouth. What was the plan for that Ukrainian territory? That it should be used as sort of Crimea should be a resort for Germans. Ukrainians should be these second-rate citizens kept in villages where they work 6 days a week. And on weekends they dance, and maybe once in a lifetime they go to visit Berlin, and they're in awe of the Aryan master race's capital, and they feel really inadequate. So the Galicia thing is very, very similar in that perspective, where they were facilitating by essentially helping Nazi Germany. They were facilitating this plan in which they would be at best second-rate citizens, but at worst essentially, akin to slaves or to serfs in this new larger German Reich. Also, he doesn't necessarily explicitly mention this in some of his articles, but it is kind of a trajectory for him. You could sort of read between the lines. Whenever he criticizes the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists or the Galician division and all of these things that actually sometimes were aligned. And when the Galician division was destroyed, some of its members went to work with this Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists towards the end of World War II, et cetera, et cetera. What he emphasizes is that there was a lot of violence. There was not a lot of state building. State building was almost non-existent. So there are, you could hear some criticism sometimes, people who say, well, look at Stalin. He was so ruthless, which is true. But Stalin was very, very good at state building. Was Bandera good at state building? He did nothing. Was Shukhevich good at state building? There was nothing. There was just this excessive violence. There was nothing to build this supposed Ukrainian state. And in some cases, of course, they were, like I said, aiding Nazi Germany that did not have plans to have Ukrainians at the same level as German citizens that would be, vacationing in Crimea, et cetera, et cetera. So that lack of state building on the part of these so-called nationalists, and he goes back to World War I as well, the Russian Civil War. He talks about Petlura, for instance. Same criticism, lots of violence, no state building. So this is kind of that common thread where there's chaos and no state building. I think if we look at modern Ukraine, we could sort of extrapolate that lack of state building. Now, obviously, yes, there is a war going on, and it's been going on since 2014, but there's really not a lot of effort to create. There is a lot of destruction of banning, censoring, destroying, et cetera, et cetera. And it's kind of this parallel that runs through Ukrainian history. And I'm not sure if you saw the piece where I translated from Ukraine to the ruin. And at one point, Ukraine actually was called the ruin in going further back in history. And so what the argument that Buzina makes in that piece is that every couple of hundred years, Ukraine descends into such chaos that it almost disappears, and that it kind of rises up again as a phoenix, and then it descends into chaos again. So he makes a pretty convincing case for that going back to the 1600s. And I think if he were still alive today, he would be making some pretty fascinating commentary about the chaos into which Ukraine descended since 2014.
Why do you think that Ukraine has been so inept at state building? Is it that something that's unique to Ukraine? Because fascism often has trouble with state building because of its extremes and its irrationality. I know people like to call Ukraine incremental nationalism. It's another form of fascism. But why do you think that they've always had trouble with building a stable and strong state? Is it
well, when you're focusing on extreme ethno-nationalism, and then you're trying to cut off things coming from other historic periods, for instance, you're removing features of things that were built during the Russian Empire, things that were built during the Soviet Union that benefited that region, then you're really left with not much. So they're not really taking advantage of things that existed prior to, them trying to build this independent state. And when you're focusing on this extreme ethno-nationalism, it's not really going to take you very far, because you have history that has been intertwined with other people. So obviously, this goes back to the question of language in Ukraine, where you had, very roughly speaking, Russian speakers in the east and the south, Ukrainian speakers in the west. Kiev has kind of been both in some ways in more recent decades. Obviously, things have changed with the exodus of people, even before, I would say, since the Orange Revolution. That's one of the comments that Buzina makes, that the exodus of Ukrainians, and also just the lack of births since the Soviet collapse, exceeded the numbers of people that died during World War II, which is pretty shocking, because he's writing this in pre-Maidan, pre-war in Donbass, right? So people just were immigrating or emigrating, I guess, in droves from Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. So, that's another thing to keep in mind.
It also reminds me of this book. I think it's called, it's like right there. Let me see if I can grab it. The War in Ukraine. I think it's the war in Ukraine. But they talk about how the Ukrainians have trouble developing a state because they don't know how to define their own nation. It's always defined by what it's not instead of what it actually is. So yeah, that kind of reminds me of the same.
Yeah, I think I've always used that idea where you have a negative identity, and instead of focusing on something positive about you. But of course, if you focus on that positive or those positive features, and let's say you go back to ancient Rus or Kievan Rus, you have to look at the triune people that Buzina talks about, right? So technically, the way that historians, and it doesn't have to be Russian historians, look at Kievan Rus, they look at it as the source of Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, more than 1,000 years ago, which I think is a very legitimate way, and it's obviously historically documented. And then you could say, yes, eventually we have this new Ukrainian state that is pursuing different politics, and it's now a separate political entity from Russia. That's completely fine. But when you're sort of completely claiming that, that entity to yourself, it's ahistoric. So yeah, I would say when you're completely removing all these really important things, and removing language, removing culture, then you're not really left with much.
I guess in their denial of not wanting to be Russian, they're removing their own identity by removing everything that they say is Russian.
Right.
It's kind of painting themselves in sort of this interesting corner of Like,
Yeah, I mean, negative identity is not gonna go very far. And I mean, you kind of obviously you can always have some kind of ethnocultural pride, which is being presented in a constructive way. But if you're constantly comparing yourself with others and it's done in a very hostile way, actually, to go back to the fiasco with the Galician division, I think it's interesting that with all the sort of whitewashing we've seen in the aftermath, they're often claiming that it was an entity that targeted Russians, but it was actually operating in Western Ukraine, former Polish territories, and they're also targeting Poles. And if you talk to some Poles today, they're actually quite outraged that it's being much like the Ukrainian nationalists. Poles were one of their main targets, if not the main target, because this is Western Ukraine that Stalin attached to the Soviet Union in the late 30s, right? That used to be part of Poland. So they're quite enraged by the fact that there is this whole trajectory of like, oh yes, they're just these misguided nationalists that had to join Hitler because this is a powerful enemy of the Soviet Union, when many of the targets were Polish. And I think that's one of the reasons the Polish government was talking about extradition of this, what was he, 98-year-old man, right? And a lot of people are saying, well, look, you knew whom you allied with when you started supporting post-Maidan Ukraine. But I would be a little bit more, I guess, empathetic to that idea, where that question was never really handled fully for Poland. Obviously, a lot of Banderites fled to Canada and other places, so there was never really sort of an organized trial for the kinds of atrocities that they committed. So I would say for Poland, it is an open question. And, I guess today we live in a world where everything is offensive, but it's like, this is a question that is legitimately offensive. And people have their great grandparents and grandparents, right, that had memories from that period, and they have specific stories linked to those paramilitary formations or military formations, right? So it's definitely a serious question for Poles, and they're almost offended that they're kind of being left out from this conversation when those entities were used to target them. So,
I mean, I don't want to get too off of JM's kind of format, but the entire whitewashing of the situation in Canada has been such a comedy for me. I mean, instead of getting frustrated, it's just been like, I mean, even the initial introduction was he fought the Ukrainian War of Independence against Russia. And I was like, what war was that?
No, he said they fought against the Russians in World War II. He's a Ukrainian hero, he's a Canadian hero, and then, lots of inane applause ensued. So for me, it was also a moment of, I am vindicated.
Yes. And even the same week, he goes to Babin Yar and totally whitewashes that tragedy. I was like, that was the largest massacre of Jews during World War II, and Poles were included. And of course, he had to throw in the assumption that maybe some OUN were mixed in. And I was just like, this week is just psychotic. This is the most off the rails week I think that we've had since the entire conflict started.
Yeah, but I think it's the logical conclusion to having these politics, and also having Ukraine almost raised to sainthood in terms of its current official politics, right? So obviously Canada has had that history. I don't know if it's amusing because of how obvious it is, so I can understand why you think it's almost like it's so absurd, it's funny. But I would say with my experiences in Canada, it was kind of a slow learning process, because it's not like you could just go online and read the stuff. You're sort of experiencing little bits and pieces here and there, and you're sort of putting it together. So I would say that there are sort of different diasporas coming from Ukraine. So there's that old pre-World War II, right, sort of late 19th century, early 20th century immigration. Now, some of those are certainly from Western Ukraine, but I would say they're not really connected to Ukraine. I mean, today they probably are politically with, their flags and stuff like that. But beyond having last names and maybe some very basic subscription to certain foods that are culturally from that region, they're pretty much Anglo-Canadianized, right? Then there are other diasporas, let's say those that came from I would say, the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you had a lot of people coming from Eastern and Southern Ukraine that are either Russian or Russophonic or Russified, right? So there are those different ones. And I would say politically, they are fairly, neutral. Maybe today they're not neutral. Some of them are certainly supportive of Russia, not all, of course. And then, of course, you have a very particular Western Ukrainian diaspora that came in waves. So the Banderites that came, like Christia Freeland's grandpa, another anti-Russian hero who
Yeah, a really great.
yeah. And then you have the ones that came out of the Soviet collapse, and they are very, very hostile. And some of them are very openly hooray SS Galicia. It's quite fascinating, actually, for me, coming as a Russian immigrant, to encounter that in a Western country that, was obviously an ally of the Soviet Union. It sounds very naive today, but when you first see it, it's a little bit shocking.
I think tomorrow, actually, we're going to talk about it with Diana Johnstone, but she has explored this concept of there being two different World War IIs. Well, actually, there's three, but for most of us in the West, there's two. And that there's the Eastern Front with Russia, and then there's like Normandy. And in the West, we don't learn about the Eastern Front. So it's very simple to whitewash everything that happened. I don't think that I knew that 27 million, well, I don't think that I was taught that 27 million Russians died until I was in university. So
right. Well, it wasn't just Russians, right? It was the Soviet people,
Soviets,
of which some were Ukrainians. So yes, so when they say that an anti-Russian hero fought in World War II and he is 98 years old, he wasn't just fighting ethnic Russians, he was also fighting ethnic Ukrainians and everyone else who participated in the first Ukrainian front that was heading westward. So yeah, it's really
that's important, because when, like I said, when Zelensky went to the Babin Yar Memorial, the people that were killed, the Ukrainians that were killed, were usually Soviet POWs. They weren't like the OUN or
of
UPA.
course.
So for all intents and purposes, they were, for the Western viewers, they were Russians because they were Soviets. They were Ukrainians fighting on the Soviet side. There was 7 million Ukrainians on the Soviet side?
I think the number was a little bit smaller. If you actually go to the last Buzina article I translated, I think it was a little bit lower, but yeah, it was a pretty significant number. It was lower than ethnic Russians. But again, even there, I think it's a bit difficult because the way that the Soviet Union looked at nationalities, sometimes they looked at last names. So let's say if they were to look at my mom's last name, it's probably the most Russian sounding name you'll ever see. It's very common, but my mom was actually born in Georgia. She's not fully Georgian. She's part Russian too. But if you were to see what she looks like versus her last name, she's classified as Russian, but she's definitely not Russian. So even there, when they say, well, it was this number of Russians versus, they're looking at last names, they're looking at these sort of passport classifications. So it's a little bit of a gray area. I would say it's fairly accurate, but there's certainly some exceptions there too. So it could have been Jews with Russified last names too. So it didn't just pertain to one nationality. So yeah, it's the numbers are a little bit, you could kind of look at them, but kind of make exceptions too. So
want to give a on-air shout out to Two Hands. Thank you very much. And then I think since we're starting on the Canadian path, I think just to round out my Buzina line of query before we go into the diaspora, or back into round off that topic, what I would want to ask about is what was Buzina's positive vision for Ukrainian patriotism?
Well, he wanted to look at all the periods of its history objectively, much like I look at Russian history objectively. I look at the imperial period, and there are good and bad, to put it very sort of roughly speaking, right? Features of the imperial period. There are good and bad things about the Soviet Union, but overall, this is our history. We can take it or leave it. We interpret it as objectively as we can. Obviously, we have our own small biases here and there, but generally speaking, we don't want to remove an entire, period because there's some things about it that we don't like. And so that's how he perceived Ukraine. So he wanted eventually to have, I'm not sure if he actually saw it as a single political entity, but he definitely wanted to have more integration and cooperation of the three East Slavic people, so the Belarusians, the Russians, and the Ukrainians. He definitely wanted to maintain the two languages, depending on where each people lived and what language they grew up with, et cetera, et cetera. So he himself spoke Ukrainian and Russian fluently, both languages. So he kind of had a very constructive view of Ukraine as a country in that sense. But obviously, the one thing that he would have removed is that Banderite / SS Galicia trajectory that was unacceptable to him. He also wasn't a big fan of the amount of control that Washington was exerting on Ukraine since 2004, and he openly criticized that influence in a lot of his articles. He obviously criticized corruption in the Ukrainian government that, predates Zelensky. It goes all the way back to much, I would say to the post-Soviet period. It's not specific to Ukraine. Obviously, there are other, look at Russian oligarchs of the 1990s. There was a lot of government / business corruption there too. In Ukraine, it seems to have stayed to a much greater extent. Putin cleaned it up to a certain extent. It's not like it's completely gone. Obviously, no country is perfect. But I would say in Ukraine, it was remained much more prominent into the 2000s and going all the way, obviously, until today. We kind of see, we don't even have to mention the type of corruption that exists in Ukraine now. We see bits and pieces of that in the news. So yeah, he was very critical of government corruption. He was critical of that World War II revisionism and World War I revisionism as well, with Petlura, who was also massacring the Jews, for example. So he had a much more positive, inclusive view of Ukraine, but he wanted to maintain, he didn't want to get rid of one of the other language. So it was definitely a challenge to the new, much more ethno-nationalist Ukrainian ideology that was sort of raised to the top since 2014. And it had roots in the 90s, but it's been getting worse, obviously, since 2014.
Well, I find it very funny that you would say that Washington was dominating anything. After all, the song Razom nas Bohato Ras ni Podolate assured me that they were breaking the chains. They did so at Eurovision in 2005.
Right.
So back to Ukraine and Banderites. I'm not sure where to start. Should we start with Russia in the 1990s, which brought you to North America, and then your voyage of discovery, or should we start with the voyage of discovery?
Well, I think we should sort of mention that we kind of refer to the fact that after World War II, a lot of Banderites from Western Ukraine ended up leaving and escaping the war crime trials. That's actually one of the arguments that's used, right? That they were never really tried officially. Therefore, they are, innocent until proven guilty. It's almost like watching some of these, true crime shows where they show someone that has DNA evidence, witness evidence, circumstantial evidence. It's this whole package, but they still have to refer to this person as an alleged killer until they're convicted. So all these, let's say, Banderites fled. They were not convicted, therefore, they didn't actually do any of these things. It's this very bizarre, legalistic, I would say, very North American view in that sense, by looking at things in this way. So we have this whole diaspora, like Christia's, our favorite Christia's grandpa, who was, this editor of this massive Nazi propaganda newspaper going into Canada, and they were accepted with open arms. They were not questioned at all. I mean, you see bits and pieces of information about this, how they would be checking for their SS tattoos. I don't know. It was an illegitimate source. I don't know if that actually happened, but it does kind of tell you that they were not,
Right.
for Canada being an ally and having had its own, troops in World War II on the Soviet side. It was a little bit interesting.
It's kind of like Canada was like, you know what, USA, you got your Operation Paperclip going on, and we got to get in on that. And the USA was probably like, you can't have any of the Germans, they're ours. And Canada's like, all right, we'll take the Ukrainians. But important for our listeners to know, like Nina said, they were checking for their tattoos, just like Russia was when they were bringing in Azov. But it was Canada who told Britain to speed up the process and to start waiving these checks. So Canada willfully took on whatever was thrown at them. Also important to note that they were changed from prisoners of war or war criminals to the status of displaced persons. So that made them into refugees. So they've just decriminalized them as far as they can really go.
Which would be, you could say, Christia, I understand you have no control over your past. Like, I get it. You have no control over what your grandpa did in that period. But when you're really lionizing his achievements, then it becomes a problem, right? So I think as someone who moves, whose family immigrates to Canada, obviously I was little, and sort of you start discovering this information, bits and pieces, not as this whole thing. You realize there are statues to, let's say Shuhevich in Edmonton, who was the leader of UPA, but also the Ukrainian nationalist, but he also was affiliated with the Wehrmacht, right? So he was sort of very, very, very clear-cut affiliation. You have statues to this man. You have other monuments in Oakville, Canada, all over, right? And obviously, if you were to ask the Polish community of the greater Toronto area whether this is acceptable, they would have a very strong opinion about this fact. So it's, obviously the fact that Canada is so multicultural and it tries to maintain this artificial diversity to the point where there's no questioning, like, oh yeah, these guys are worshiping these Nazi collaborators, and here's this, Poles living right next to them who were suffering at their hands. That's not an issue. This is kind of like, it becomes problematic when it's at that level. So I can think of some, I guess this would be a good example of the things that some of the members of the Ukrainian diaspora would do. It would be this almost like really petty stuff that really didn't gain them anything, and it didn't really harm the Russian community. So here's an example I'm thinking of. Canada has different folk festivals for its different ethnicities. Different cities have them. And so, for example, the Russians would have their own pavilion, their own little tent with, just very generic, here's some nesting dolls, here's Russian food, very benign stuff. So you would have some members of the Ukrainian diaspora going in and checking where the nesting dolls were made and then claiming, oh, these ones were probably not made in Russia. They might have been made in Ukraine. and coming, making this whole big stink about it, trying to get the Russian pavilion canceled. And this was way before the Maidan. So it was that level of stuff that I would see over and over again. And to me, it was just so stupid. It's like, you're not gaining anything. You're just like this, catty girl in high school who gets this, I guess, a little bit of a rush from causing a little bit of an inconvenience to someone. But ultimately, the Russian community goes on, the Western Ukrainian diaspora goes on, nothing happens. So you would see that type of stuff. And then let's say I would be looking for a very specific book in a library, and it would be a huge library that would have sort of this Ukrainian section with Russian and Ukrainian language books. And I would see a book on Kievan Rus, right? Ancient Rus. And I would be flipping through it. And not only would a city like Kiev would be described as an exclusively Ukrainian city in the year 988, but they would also describe Russian cities like Novgorod and Murom as that have never been part of Ukraine as Ukrainian cities 1,000 years ago. So you would not see this in English language historiography. You would not see this in Russian language historiography. It was very bizarre alternative history. So of course I would see things like that, and I started having questions like, what's going on? This is just absolutely bizarre. So this is kind of where it started.
So I think that's actually a good place to leap off, because we all saw the clip from about, I think, May 2022 with Ambassador Nevyenzia reading out a Ukrainian history textbook, and I was like, yeah, well, the Russians can print anything. They can make stuff up. And then I read some pro-Ukrainian academics, and I was like, oh my God. So could you tell us about perhaps a bit more that, oh my God?
Well, there's one trajectory that doesn't go as far. I mean, there's some that go back thousands of years, but there's one, for instance, where they completely deny any Scandinavian influence on ancient Russia. So, the official historiography, as it was the Rurikid dynasty that started, it was the Varangians, right? So there's that very strong Scandinavian connection, and it's historically documented. It's documented archaeologically, but I've seen books where there is a complete denial of any influence, and there's very sort of creative way of trying to change the names to not sound Scandinavian, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I don't understand whom that serves. Just to say that the proto-Ukrainians were first. I'm not, I don't know what other conclusion to draw from that. It's a very strange denial of any Scandinavian influence. I wouldn't say this happens in every alternative Ukrainian history book, but it happens in some. I've seen the one that was circulating, and you could still go online and buy it. It was called The History of Ukraine from Herodotus until the present. So they're taking, a Greek thinker and claiming that he was writing the history of Ukraine, more than 2,000 years ago. So again, it's you don't have Russians saying, "Oh, the Scythians were actually ethnically Russian." The Scythians may have lived in Eurasia, but they're actually ethnically Russian. There are direct genetic ancestors. That would be bizarre. So you kind of have that thing, and I think it happens because what we talked about earlier, this negative identity and trying to find other roots in order to disconnect yourself from the Belarusians and from the Russians and from the Poles, basically all of your neighbors. So
Yeah, lost in the fog of war, giving a hat tip and a shout out, and indeed we feel lost in the fog of war given the sort of things that our guest is, I think, very accurately and articulately describing. So, when would you say that in Canada, for what you found out, that these sorts of groups went from going into hiding to starting to emerge from the shadows and starting to really shape policy in a more public way that in turn kind of brings them to light, that allows people to draw connections?
well, I don't know exactly when the Ukrainian Congress in Canada was established, but it's definitely been a few decades, and it's a very powerful institution. It's has direct links to Canada's, favorite politician, Chrystia Freeland, because her family member is highly positioned, absolutely not nepotistic at all. But yeah, it's a very important voting bloc in Canada. Obviously, much like in America, when certain politicians try to target certain ethnocultural groups. It's the same thing in Canada. The Ukrainian voting bloc is kind of an important voting bloc, and so it's much more populous than, let's say, the Russians. And of course, when we say Russians, a lot of times they mean everyone that came from the former Soviet Union. So it might not even include people coming from Russia. It might include, the former Central Asian republics as Russian. So the Ukrainian voting bloc is quite populous. And the Ukrainian Congress of Canada is a prominent political body, and they have really been participating with all this sort of nonsense with World War II revisionism, et cetera, et cetera. So if you start Googling them and looking where their little fingers are in, it's some really nasty stuff. So I'm not sure exactly from their establishment to where they are now when it happened, but it's been happening for a few decades.
Yeah, and we can certainly see the effects of that with Chrystia Freeland's broad grin and rapturous applause when Hunka was coming in. And I think this is something that I would want to make clear to our listeners. Well, we mock Western politicians, but Chrystia Freeland's a really well-read, really smart, really articulate woman. She knows these sorts of details down pat. It's why she's the power behind the throne.
She's well
So
educated, right? She's studied at the best academic institutions. She did, some work actually in the late Soviet Union on site. So she speaks the languages. So yeah, she's absolutely not a naive observer who can claim ignorance. She's definitely a direct participant, and I would make a further claim that behind the scenes, she is one of the initiators of these sorts of actions. So.
yes, a very well connected and very smart, clued in woman, and so therefore she one not to be underestimated, and therefore her where she's self hugging with her hands. It's a little disingenuous.
Which is
But
interesting that she was not anticipating. I know the video you're referring to, that she was not anticipating the question that has, been in international media since it happened, and she really had no way of answering it other than using a lot of words to deflect completely from the question. So yeah, it's pretty telling. The body
but
language is pretty telling.
But you also, of course, mentioned Polish Canadians, and also something that I've been mauling about to anybody who will listen is that the Waffen SS killed 156 Canadians just in the first 2 weeks of the Battle of Normandy. And I don't mean killed in action, I mean these are Canadian soldiers who got their positions overrun, they surrendered, and then the SS just murdered them. The Chief of the Defense Staff of Canada has refused to apologize for applauding an SS man when SS men killed Canadian soldiers who'd surrendered in cold blood. And the fact that she was surprised by this, where do you think that sense of impunity comes from, to the extent that they're surprised that people would object when, I mean, Canadian Ukrainians are numerous, but they're not the majority. So where
Mhm.
does that sense of impunity come from?
Yeah, actually, very good point about the vets, because I was kind of actually searching. Have they ever? I know these apologies are obviously PR stunts, but I was just kind of shocked that there was not an apology issued to Canadian vets and their families that are, I'm not sure if that many vets are still around. Their families certainly are, but they issued an apology to Zelensky's government, which was pretty telling of who's important to the Canadian government. But yeah, I would say the impunity comes from two things, obviously being in power, and that idea of bombarding people with constant war propaganda and almost, glamorizing Ukraine and almost canonizing it. So making that sort of false parallel between Ukraine's struggle today, right, versus Ukraine's quote unquote struggle in World War II. But also, I would say that this sort of more mild revisionism has been in the media for a while. So they've been kind of feeding the public this information slower, but for, I would say, more than a decade, if not longer, raising certain questions, criticizing the Soviet Union, or simply, like you said, not teaching about anything about the Eastern Front, where Western historians estimate 75 to 80% of German losses occurred. That's a pretty important number to teach you. It's, I think, but it's not really presented. So I would say it's kind of that gradual revisionism. Some of it had more benign forms, like Hollywood, Saving Private Ryan, etc., etc. But it kind of took a darker turn with some of the more recent that political article that claimed that just because they pledged allegiance to Hitler and fought alongside outside of Lvov or Lviv in 1944 does not mean that they're actually collaboration forces with Nazi Germany. So there was that trajectory with Hollywood, with more benign articles, with simply not teaching about the Soviet Union or the Allies. It's actually very interesting to me because I had multiple family members, multiple ancestors participating in World War II in different ways. One of them, was a woman, a nurse. So she was helping out, obviously, injured soldiers. One of them was participating in the Arctic convoys. So he was in Murmansk, I guess is how you would say it in English. And he was interacting with the Americans during World War II. So I have that family history of a direct experience of the Allies, right? Shipping Lend-Lease equipment to the far north in the Soviet Union and Russia. And it's like, it's my family member. He actually, I was too little. He passed away, but he'd tell my dad, for instance, that he remembers drinking with the Americans when they delivered supplies in World War II. That's just such a kind of just an interesting little bit of personal history in the grander context of World War II. So I kind of have that look on the the grand alliance, right, between Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union, kind of this personal look beyond what I know historically. So yeah, it's been problematic for a while.
Yeah, I think anybody in the West with the sense of the Grand Alliance and who grew up with some sense of that certainly found the whole episode distasteful. I, for example, was thinking about the Bill Malden cartoon. If our listeners have never heard about it, Bill Malden was this very young guy who served in the Italian theater and drew cartoons for Stars and Stripes, the U.S. Soldiers magazine. And one of them was a bunch of U.S. soldiers sitting down at a card game, and one of the U.S. Soldiers saying to them, "You Irishmen would have lost this war long ago without allies like Texas and Russia." So that sort of, even in the, that sort of context, the sense of the Grand Alliance, and I think any American soldier on the front would have been very, very grateful to the Red Army, because as far as they were concerned, it's like, well, as far as we're concerned, the Germans have too many tanks, too much artillery, and too many men, and we're really grateful that we don't have to deal with more of them. So,
Right.
I think that there was that shocking factor. But speaking of shocking factors, and something I hope to touch upon, one of the articles that I read that touched me the most and that I found most shocking in terms of personal anecdotes was your article about what it was like in the 1990s. So, can you tell us a bit about the 1990s?
Yeah, this is an interesting transition from from Canadian whitewashing to the 1990s. Well, obviously, this was shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and there was a lot of propaganda about market capitalism and life being just like in America, in a very cartoonish way, where people would be chewing bubble gum, and it almost had that vibe of, if you watch 80s movies from Hollywood, there's that 80s optimism, right? So it almost had that vibe. And obviously, the actual reality was much, much, much darker. So there was just this, it's actually kind of an interesting thing where a lot of anti-Soviet propagandists would show you images of empty store shelves and say, look, this is the Soviet Union, but they're showing you empty store shelves from the late 80s during Perestroika, when Gorbachev was slowly demolishing the Soviet Union and going into the early 90s when it was or did collapse. And you did have these massive shortages. But yeah, you had children receiving humanitarian aid coming from the West in schools. And it was these large cans of Spam, very long cans, and they were expired. I've never seen Spam in this long can. I think it was only made for, the expiration date was like way off. They were still handing the stuff out.
I didn't think Spam did expire.
Well,
Didn't know that it
this is right. So, I mean, you just had, my family left pretty early, but obviously there's a lot of, documentation of how rapid the social collapse was from, let's say, from the standpoint of illicit drugs. Now, there was a little bit, let's say, of marijuana coming from Central Asia into the Soviet Union, but generally speaking, drugs did not exist. Alcohol existed, right? And all of a sudden, you have all this really serious stuff coming from Afghanistan, but through, the former Central Asian republics and flooding Russia. So, people would be walking and just collapsing in the streets. So it wasn't even the fact that, the stereotype of the drunk Russian, which is highly exaggerated. It was definitely relevant in that period, but serious drugs like heroin were really just destroying the country. You had obviously terrorism with especially sort of the militants in Chechnya and some other parts of the Northern Caucasus. You had Yeltsin, initiating the first Chechen war. And another interesting point, so whenever people want to criticize Putin, they talk about the second Chechen war, that he was too heavy-handed. They never criticize Yeltsin for the first Chechen war, which was also, a pretty violent conflict. You had inter-ethnic conflict going in all the former Soviet republics to different extents, of course. Abortion skyrocketed. People would faint literally from hunger, if not starvation. There's a lot of documentation. They would go dumpster diving. They would eat pigeons. So like really serious stuff. Not just like, oh, I can't have oranges today or something like that. Like literal lack of food. So you kind of had that social collapse really hit you very, very quickly. And at the same time, you're having, Gorbachev promoting Pizza Hut. You're having Yeltsin hanging out with his best friend Bill Clinton, and Bill is playing saxophone, and it's all presented in this very PR ish way of we're heading towards the bright future as market shock shock doctrine was being introduced, and people were losing their savings, and there was hyperinflation. So that period, I would say, from the early 90s until 1998, that was really at that point, it didn't seem like the country would survive, that it would actually sort of fulfill some anti-Russian ideologue's dream of splitting into further little ethnic enclaves and having, separate Siberia or something like that, because things were collapsing so fast. So
I think that would be actually a good last question to close out on, because when I read this article, what struck me was like how much it read like a country in the midst of a famine. In particular, like clinging on to this one source of food that you suddenly got and just carefully parsing it out, or having that foul smelling brown soap, but it was like, well, we got it for free, so that's what we're going to bathe with and wash everything
and yes,
with.
wash as a dish soap, as a soap for bathing yourself, and for washing clothes. It was, yes, I remember, it was this large, very stinky, yeah.
So how would you describe so how would you say that in terms of a traumatizing calamity, that would it be fair to round together all these elements like Ukraine and Russia, the 1990s in memory, that it would be fair to characterize the 1990s as being as big a trauma as the 1930s famine?
I'm not well, I mean, if you actually look at some statistical estimates as to how many people died, and I think the life expectancy fell to like the 50s or like 52, something really significantly lower than where it was. Today life expectancy, if it's not, at the upper 70s or 80s, it sounds shocking and bad. So we were at like 52 or something like that. So it just depends on how you interpret these statistics. So if you're counting all the babies that would have been born but were not born because everyone was essentially aborting them and because they couldn't feed them, right? If you count all the deaths from drugs and alcohol and just the stress of living and early death at in their 50s, then you are going to reach millions, if not tens of millions. Maybe not for just Russia, but all of the former Soviet Union. In that sense, it would be comparable to a major famine or a major disaster of some kind.
I think it's kind of hard to top that for something to close out, but you've been fantastic. I think this has flowed very wonderfully. So before we close out, would there any last thoughts that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I love being on. I'd love to be on again. Maybe we can discuss something other than Ukraine, because it's been sort of in the news for so long. We can certainly talk about other subjects. But yeah, thank you for having me. This was fun.
Thank you. I loved it. Really loved it. I learned a lot. So thank you both. Nina, why don't you tell everybody where they can find you?
Well, you can go on my former Twitter, or X. I don't know if Elon Musk would be very offended if we're calling it Twitter. Yeah, just look me up as Nina Byzantina, the way it shows up here. So you can go to my site. Slowly building my YouTube. I chose to do more of a historic trajectory, which takes slower growth than doing sort of more polarizing politics. But I think eventually it'll pay off. You can read my translations at ninabyzantina.com. You could support me and buy me a coffee. You can invite me on your podcast. Shameless plug. But yeah, I think this was super fun. And thank you for letting me introduce myself again.
I will attest to that. I think Nina put up a post that said, nobody invites me on their podcast. And I was like, really? Oh my God. So I ran right to the replies, like, come on the podcast. But thank you again. And thank you, JM. As always, you're such a fantastic co-host. All of Nina's links will be provided in the description, and please visit ddgeopolitics.com to see how you could support our project and follow us on other platforms. Once again, thank you for tuning in, and our next episode will be with Diana Johnstone as we talk about the parallels between Yugoslavia and Ukraine. Thanks again, and free Palestine.
All right.